This is a copycat league, and when something is successful, other teams will try and emulate it. There were a lot of things that teams like Michigan did this year that they succeeded in that other teams tried to do and sort of failed.
I think that when you looked at the portal even 3 years ago, the most overvalued player was like the undersized combo guard gunner. The story of this year's portal evaluations to me are going to be which teams can get the actual good players from that batch.
Hey everybody, welcome to the EvanMiya College Basketball Show. I'm your host, Evan Miyakawa, and the college basketball season is over. The Michigan Wolverines are your national champions, a very fitting team to cut down the nets after what has been a really awesome season of college basketball. We will get into how Michigan got here and everything else that went down in the Final Four. I've got Eric Fawcett here with me on deck in a second to break it all down. I really enjoyed Indianapolis as a Final Four city, so I'll also share some of my experiences towards the end of the show. And now that we are in the off-season, the cadence of this show will change a little bit, so I'll provide some more detail on that as well. And of course, we had a listener contest this week with a lot of submissions, so I will announce the winner of that at the end of the show. They will win some free merch from the evanmiya.com merch store, like this hat that I'm wearing here. Lots of great stuff to get to today. All right, without further ado, let's get into the Final Four weekend that we just had, ending with the Michigan Wolverines as your 2026 national champions. And with me to do that is Eric Fawcett, one of the great X's and O's evaluators in our sport, among other things. Eric, let's start with the game from Monday night and then work our way backwards a little bit. Final score, Michigan 69, UConn 63. I think the interesting thing about this was it was well documented coming into this game how Michigan had totally steamrolled pretty much every opponent in their path up to this point and had done it in their way, high scoring games, high pace games. And if UConn was going to have a chance at winning this game, they were going to have to not let Michigan basically get on a steamroll like they've done before. And when you look at kind of how this played out game plan wise, it was kind of in UConn's favor. This is final stuff here. UConn made 9 threes compared to Michigan's 2. Michigan shot 13% from 3. Their previous game against Arizona, they made 12. UConn out-rebounded Michigan, which is something that's very rare, 46-39, and UConn almost got 50% of their offensive rebound opportunities. And that is the worst defensive rebounding performance by Michigan all season. Their previous worst was against Duke. Michigan only had 2 fast break points. Michigan only had 4 points off turnovers. They had 26 against Arizona. And it was a slow-paced game. First half only had 29 possessions. It ended up at 66, but still well below Michigan's average. And yet, Michigan still wins this game sort of semi-comfortably. It certainly wasn't a blowout, but they had the lead for most of the game. It was close here and there, but ultimately it didn't go down to the final possession there. Tactically, very interesting battle, even if the game was a little bit ugly. What were your main takeaways from Michigan's championship win over UConn?
I think to start, it's the 1-to-4 switching that Michigan has used and kind of well publicized at this moment, but for it to bump up against a UConn team that's so known for all that off-ball action, I think even on the first possession of the game for UConn, they started getting into their kind of regular stuff. There's a chin screen, there's the first shooter curling around a screen, but it's really a decoy to set up the second shooter, and Michigan's just like not moving. Like it's almost like they're in a zone, the way that they will switch and keep their size and length at the rim. And right away, I will say going into the game, I really thought this was going to be close. And if anyone wants the receipts, they can probably go find a scout team episode I did with Kevin Sweeney. But I watched that first possession and I was like, oh man, if this is the plan for UConn, I'm not sure it's going to work. And you could tell that, right away they didn't have something that was super well suited towards that kind of switching coverage. And I think they certainly found some ways later in the game and were able to exploit that a little bit. But I think right from the jump, we saw just how disruptive that kind of switching coverage can be. And I think for so many people, switching looks easy to do. It's not the most complex thing. There's maybe a little bit of like chicken chicken or the egg? Like, is Michigan so good because they switch, or do they switch because they're so good defensively and have all these guys? But I think that was probably the first thing that jumped out to me. And also because I certainly had my eyes on that. What is UConn? What is Luke Murray? These guys known for such good offensive game plans, such precise tactical approaches to what they're going to do offensively. What are they going to do with this Michigan switching coverage? And I don't think they solved the puzzle there. I'm not saying it was a disaster. I'm not saying they failed. They had a couple of good moments late where they only started to use Terrace Reed or the 5 as the screener, because that's the only way you could keep Michigan from switching, and they got some good looks out of that. But overall, that was kind of the big storyline going in for me from a kind of X's and O's standpoint. And obviously that one I would say went in favor of in favor of Michigan. And now there's other things, and you mentioned it with all the stats at the beginning. One of the other things that I thought was really fascinating was I did think that UConn was going to do a good job of keeping Michigan off the 3-point line, and they did a really good job of running them off and sending them into help where those attacked closeouts weren't punished. And then I thought they did a really good job in transition defense, often just not really even sending guys to the offensive glass. I kind of liked a lot of situations, throughout the year, UConn would maybe send their 5 or their 4 and their 5. And if they want to be really aggressive, they'd send 3. But often in this game, they really kind of sent 1, and it was like the point guard, because if they're just so that as soon as Michigan got the ball, the point guard would be there to jam up the outlet and slow things down that way. And I thought they did that to an incredible level. And I almost think that's later in the game you saw even Mullins get some incredible offensive rebounds. I feel like it was because for the first half of the game, no one was even going after the offensive glass. Then they started to, really surprise them a little bit. And that's also why I look at that offensive rebounding number and I'm like, that is astonishing, because for the first half of the game, it didn't even seem like they were trying. But those were some of the things I thought going in, and it's really interesting. I thought every interesting kind of schematic matchup between these two teams ended up being a really interesting schematic matchup. And that's why, I know there's a lot of hipster kind of coverage in college basketball media space. There's a lot of people that like to go against the grain, but I mean this with all seriousness. I know a lot of people thought this game was kind of a slog, not a very good one. I thought this game was tremendous. I thought the way that every possession had just incredible value, and the way that both teams really executed what they were trying to do offensively.
Yes.
The other team just executed what they wanted to do defensively. And it felt like every time that the ball went through the hoop, it was because of a Herculean effort. And so I actually thought this game was fantastic. I thought that's what makes college basketball. You would never see a game like this in the NBA. You don't really see it in Europe. And this is just this is one of the games that I thought makes college basketball great, is that there can be a game like this that is so slow paced that defenses can still dominate, and it still felt like every possession was I couldn't take my eyes off everything. So this is also, I'm glad you had me on.
Yeah, I mean, this is great stuff, and I do think that sort of this perspective is why, like you said, even though the game was quote unquote slow or ugly, there was so much stuff going on here between two brilliant coaches. And I think the story of Michigan's tournament for the last several weeks has been, my goodness, they play so fast, they force so many turnovers, the offense ends up just completely blitzing people. At the end of the day, it's their defense that has really been the most consistent factor for them this year. It's why I have them ranked as the number 1 defense in the country. And the big thing that's been talked about, and it played its way in this game again, is regardless of how the 3-point shots are going down offensively or defensively for Michigan, it is their 2-point efficiency on offense and their ability to stop opponents from scoring from 2 on the defensive side. That's what happened in this game. UConn, 34% from 2. It was their worst 2-point field goal percentage performance of the season. They've only had 2 games, including this one all season, where they've been under 40% from inside the arc. So, what they were doing was working. Obviously, the presence of guys like Adai Mara on the inside is just an absolute deterrent. We saw that over and over and over again in this tournament. And then the other thing too is that just because of their physicality and length, they often have a massive foul disparity. And this is not a ref controversy thing. It's just a style of, it's the way Michigan plays. And honestly, a lot of the teams in this Final Four, especially Michigan and Arizona, typically do have a massive foul disparity in their favor that allows them to get to the line more, just because opponents just can't keep up with them. And so foul trouble was a big deal in this game, even if it wasn't the big guys for UConn. Silas Demery fouled out. He only played 21 minutes. Solo Ball, 4 fouls. He only played 16 minutes. That forced Malachi Smith to come in, and I think he played relatively well in the minutes that he had for UConn, but obviously having him play that many minutes in a title game means something isn't going your way. And then on the other end, Michigan not only got to the foul line a lot, they also shot really, really well from the line. 89%. They made 25 out of their 28 free throws, and that's one of their best free throw shooting performances of the season when you take into account how often they got to the line and their conversion rate. And, they had a massive free throw disparity in this game, similar to the way that they blew out Tennessee. It's just a way that it's a part of what they play. Let me ask you this on the schematic side, because I love that you brought up how on that first possession, you mentioned that, this may not go super well because a lot of my listeners may not necessarily be as dialed in schematically and prepared for this game as you were. If you sort of put yourself in the UConn coaching hat for a second in terms of what their game plan was coming into this, what you expected Michigan to do, and then how it actually played out, were you expecting to see the defensive scheme, the switching 1 through 4 like Michigan did, or was that a surprise? And what was the immediate then UConn should try and do this? And ultimately, did you think they were successful at that or not over the course of the game?
Yeah, great question, because when I was kind of preparing for the game and doing my preview, of course, anyone playing UConn, you're wondering, okay, what are they going to do against all this wild pin down action? So, you go and start watching Michigan's defensive possessions. And ideally, you're looking for a team that kind of plays similar to the style they're going to play. So you're like, okay, well, who plays similar to UConn? Well, not a lot of people. And then you look at the Big Ten and you're like, really not a lot of people. So in trying to find games where they really were having to trail a lot of these wide pin downs and a lot of these complex staggers and twirls and all that, I had to go all the way back to Duke, and Duke had some success with that. Ironically, a game that they lost, and then actually going way back to January in Wisconsin, a team that did a little bit of that again and had some success. So it was one of those things that on one hand I was like, well, Michigan kind of does what they do at this point. And if I'm going all the way back a month or beyond, they guarded things a different way, but I don't know if they're going to do that now. So when you go back to what they did against Duke, they got kind of caught in some instances, trailing a lot of these actions. They decided they were going to chase over the top, which is what a lot of teams that have really elite size in the front court do. When you've got a lot of size at the rim, you've got Amara, you can kind of tell guys hey, when they set these wide pin downs, chase them over the top, let's try to take away the 3-point line, because if they curl off it, okay, congratulations, you're met by a Demara. So I think that I was maybe expecting a little bit of that, though I was going, over a month back to see how they would guard it. And then, I also did a video on that for Basketball Review, and a lot of Michigan fans thought I was an idiot, and it's hey, they just switch now. That's what they do. And that was what they kind of did. And I kind of wish that, and again, I thought for UConn to just be in this game, I don't want to make it sound like I'm wow, what was UConn doing? How did they fail? They obviously, their game plan was pretty good, but I thought right away, maybe diagnosing that Michigan was going to switch everything. It took them a little while to get into Terrace Reed is our only screener. I kind of would have thought that they would have maybe earlier had some different ideas for what they wanted to do. Sometimes when teams are switching a lot of those off-ball screens, you end up being the best thing to do is actually screening your own man, freeing up someone that way, trying to get some advantageous switches, which there's not a whole lot. We know that, but if you can maybe get a switch, then try to pin that guy down, screen your own, slip off that. I just kind of felt like UConn was doing what they do as well, which they do at a high level. They're at a championship game. But that was kind of the couple of thoughts I had going in. Are they going to be the switch everything team they've been recently? Are they going to kind of chase over the top and try to take away 3-point attempts like they did earlier in the year? Michigan fans who were all in the mentions were right about this one. They were just content to switch everything, and it worked really well. And credit for some of the counters that UConn had. We saw the play that I think a lot of people looked at when Reed set 5 wide pins on the same action, and it still was a contested 3, though they hit it. They also had some of these just empty side flares where they just cleared out a side, threw a flare screen, lobbed it over the top, and at least there was a little bit of room to operate. That was one of their counters as well, which was not a bad one. But I think after that first possession, I was like, okay, you better pivot quick. And it took a little while to for them to get kind of comfortable. And that's always the challenge in any situation in basketball, particularly in a single elimination tournament. Do you do what got you there? Do you or do you try to adjust? And you saw a game in this situation where like Michigan did what Michigan does. They played the way that they've played the last 6 weeks, really. And UConn kind of did the same, got into some of the changes. And but yeah, that just speaks to how good Michigan was. And when you are the more talented team, you're the better team. Like, yeah, you can usually be the one to dictate terms a little bit. And for UConn to still be able to like dictate pace, keep Michigan out of transition. Like, man, I'm still going back to some of those stats you said off the top of the recording. If someone could have looked at that blind, you might have said like, wow, did UConn pull this off? But they didn't quite.
Yeah, I think Dan Hurley talked about it in the post game where he said, ultimately, I don't have any regrets about what our guys did or how we executed. A lot of their looks just didn't go down. And they really did try and follow a blueprint for what more often than not has been the kryptonite against Michigan, which has been just like amazing three-point shooting. UConn took 33 threes in this game. That was basically half their shots, and they only made 9 of them, 27%. And there were some contested looks, but there were also some looks that a lot of their players are used to taking that often go down, and they just weren't in this game. Now, Michigan also was in the same boat, so it kind of evened out in that sense that neither team shot the ball anywhere near as well as they did in their previous game. But I think certainly from an offensive perspective, I think UConn is happy with the looks that they got, relatively speaking, and they just didn't go down. But it is interesting to note that, UConn took 33 threes in this game. Arizona, notably a team that doesn't shoot many threes, in a higher possession game only took 17 against Michigan. So clearly that was part of the UConn plan, was we really need to shoot a lot of threes because that is going to be our way to stay in this game. And they did stay in the game, and on a different night, maybe they win this game because of that. I do want to focus, before we move on to some of the other games from this weekend, just some individual performances that stuck out to me. Elliot Cadeau ends up winning most outstanding player in this game, which just, if we went back a year and looked at the way that people were talking about Elliot Cadeau, North Carolina fans, but honestly, just a lot of national media people, when it was announced that he was in the portal and then that Michigan was taking him. I know Michigan fans who were very non-enthused with the fact that they were losing Trey Donaldson and bringing in Cadeau and thought that that was a downgrade. And looking up a year later, and he was the most outstanding player at the Final Four. I know there were some arguments that maybe a Daimara would have been more deserving. Whatever. Cadeau was the engine for this team, and his energy, even if his efficiency was just okay. I mean, looking at these performances here, in this game, he had 19 points, 5 of 11 from the field, 2 assists, 2 steals. Previous game, 13 points, 10 assists, 4 steals. He did have 6 turnovers in that game, but he was the center of everything that Michigan did offensively, and he felt very in control the whole time, and he was so disruptive defensively against both Arizona and UConn. It was just so clear the impact that he was having, and a lot of people point to you have to have really good point guards to win a national title. Cadeau would never, before the season, have been in anyone's list of best point guards in the country, yet by the end of the season, he certainly was that. I know for me personally, if you looked at his transfer grade in the offseason last year, I loved a lot of the elements of his game. I had him as a top 15 transfer, so I did think that there were some things that pointed to just things not being quite right for him at UNC, but could work in a different program. Certainly didn't expect quite this level of success. It is awesome to see how well he played. And then, of course, Yaxel Lendeborg, their star player, who was quote-unquote limited in this game with the knee injury. He played all 20 minutes in the first half, and he played 36 minutes in total. He said in the postgame, it wasn't his best game. He was having to battle through some mental stuff in terms of how his body was feeling. But it was very clear that Dusty May trusted him to say, hey, if you want to play and you want to be out there, I will let you be out there. And Yaxel battled through, even though, quote unquote, may have not have been the wisest thing for him to play. He ends up with 13 points in this game and was impactful in a lot of ways, even if he wasn't at 100%. Both of those guys just really stuck out to me. Do you just have any additional thoughts on any of those standout performances for Michigan there?
Yeah, well, I kind of think about it just kind of from a roster building standpoint, and not that everyone has the luxury of having as much size and athleticism and fluidity on the front line that Michigan does. But looking at the way that this was not someone particularly known for his defense in North Carolina, but you go put him in the switching scheme where he's almost playing like a one-man zone at the top of the lane, because he doesn't have to worry. If someone comes from behind and sets a screen, if someone cuts through, he might just switch it. And you saw him just on his toes, ready to jump on top of any action. And suddenly he's the kind of disruptive defender you're talking about. And that wouldn't have been the way that he was discussed last year, but you put him in the situation where it's like, hey, like stay on your toes, be really aggressive, trying to blow everything up, because like, oh, you get back cut, you get beat. Okay, well, there's like 3 shot blockers behind you. And just the way that style of having that much length and athleticism on the front line, it just kind of allows you to get guys that might not be known as your prototypical elite defensive players, and you can make them that way. And I think as well on the offensive end, that's something that I don't feel like the thing that I don't feel like he did enough last season was just like get to the rim, put any level of pressure on the rim. And you saw him just dance with the ball a little bit. And when he started dancing and then trying to make plays out of it, that's where the turnovers came. That's where the problems for him kind of came. And that's kind of what he was known for, is like, it was a small guard who played small. And then you just saw in this game, like the fearlessness that he went at the rim, and as well what they did against Arizona. And, you know, some was made about the just like, hey, throw it off the backboard and someone's going to go get it. And you kind of saw that kind of like freedom from him, where he was like he had some of the most physical drives I've ever seen from him in this national championship game. And it's like, okay, well, if he did that, then suddenly he would be the top 15 transfer last year in the eyes of everyone. And so I just feel like the way that this roster was so perfect for him, like like Cadeau is fantastic. I'm still not convinced you put him on a number of other teams he has the same season he does. Like, this was just like the perfect mesh of coach, player, roster, everything there. And I mean, we don't need to like get into this and maybe this is like an off-season conversation, but I think like for Cadeau to not be considered the top point guard in the portal, and not even, you know, close to it in the eyes of many. And then you look at UConn on the other end, who last year, I mean, I can certainly say now, but again, you can see the receipts for me. Like, I thought Aiden Mahaney was not it when it came to that being their big portal pickup this year. You know, Malachi Smith, Silas Demery, like good players. Don't get me wrong, but you know, I never thought that those were the guards that they needed, the guys that were going to play at the level that UConn required. And it's just like, if you're a UConn fan who's just like, man, we've just kind of swung and missed. No, I shouldn't say swung and missed. It's not like the guys this year were zeros. Mahaney was maybe close to it, arguably 2 years ago. But whatever the case may be, if you are a UConn fan, I haven't really heard anyone saying this, but I'm just wondering if UConn fans are just like, man, if we could have just like gotten a point guard once over the last 2 years, how things could have looked a little better. And I just, that's one thing I just wonder, as we of course start transitioning into roster build mode. Of course, UConn's got a whole bunch to rebuild, but it's hard to look at, you know, Demery was not a pickup. I thought was best for them. I didn't think that Cadeau was best for Michigan. Obviously was wrong there, but it just shows like there's a big swing there where like Michigan nails their point guard evaluation, what they need. UConn does not as much. And you just wonder if that UConn team we just saw had a little bit better of a point guard, someone who was a little bit more of a calming presence, a little bit more stable as a distributor, much more of a threat scoring individually. I mean, that's one thing as well, talking about Michigan's switching coverage, where UConn just didn't have anyone that's like, you could really switch and then say like, okay, no, go get a bucket against a weak defender. And that's really hard to play against switching teams when you don't have that kind of guy. So I just think that's my thought as well, when you point out just how outstanding Cadeau was.
Sure. I think, you know, especially given what UConn was used to in the title seasons with, you know, Tristan Newton and how good he was, certainly, yeah, they've not had the last 2 seasons. I do agree with you on the Mahaney thing. He certainly was a swing and a miss, especially from a defensive perspective, and part of why he didn't play a lot down the stretch. I would point out with the whole Silas Demery thing, I think that he was pretty solid this season, but then the injury slowed him down to the point where he's not had a game in probably a month where he's really been the full strength, point guard that they needed. I think, and Dan Hurley mentioned this a bunch this weekend. They had to battle through a lot of injury adversity this year. Demery obviously being the biggest one down the stretch. And I think it's inarguable that the impact that he had in the Final Four was not what he would have had probably if he were healthy and hadn't been hurt. Numerically, like from an analytics perspective, I have Demery as a top 20 player in the country based on what he did over the course of the season. I think he did a lot of what they needed him to do, even if he wasn't maybe exactly the same type of point guard fit that maybe Dan Hurley would like to perfectly have. I still think he did a lot of good things for them. And Malachi Smith was as a backup point guard, was more than capable. But certainly in this title game, compared to the impact that Elliot Cadeau had, there was an obvious difference there. So I do agree with you there. I do want to touch on the roster building stuff in a second, because I know a lot of teams are going to try and copy Michigan and what they've done. So we'll pin that. But let's just quickly go back to the Michigan-Arizona game, because I do think that this was the game coming into the weekend that everyone was talking about as being the real title game. The two best teams, certainly the game that we thought would be pretty close. I think Michigan was a slight favorite going into this. I had them predicted to win by 3. I don't think anyone saw Michigan completely boat racing Arizona. This both teams just such strong forces this year. Both are capable of doing this. I didn't see this happening. And the final score was not really illustrative of the way that Michigan totally took control of this game, because they only won this game by 18 points. But if you take out garbage time, which is something that you can look at evanmiya.com, see the non-garbage time score, that was 73-48. So basically, by the time we got to that score, it was kind of already out of mind. And that is similar to what happened against Tennessee. Their non-garbage time score against Tennessee for Michigan was 64-36. So just an absolute pummeling pretty much out of the gate. They had a 30-point lead at one point, and Michigan shot the lights out from 3 in this game, 12 for 27. The crazy stat in this one was they had a 22-5 assist margin. Like, they were able to move the ball perfectly on offense in a way, and those 22 assists doesn't even count the viral plays that were mentioned and talked about when Dusty May talked about how they had Elliot Cadeau throw the ball off the backboard as a way of passing it to a Daimara to get past Moteus Krivas and the length that Arizona had. So there were some missed shots that could be classified as assists as well, if you want to put it that way. And, on the flip side, Arizona just never, ever was able to really get any level of offensive rhythm whatsoever. And then those missed shots turned into runouts for Michigan, and they just completely took over. And some standout individual performances as well. Daimara had a career high in points in this game. None of Arizona's players were really able to get into a rhythm. I would imagine going into this game, you probably thought this was going to be a close, more even tactical battle than it was. What were your thoughts on this game as it unfolded?
Yeah, I actually didn't think it was going to be a close game. I just think like,
were you
that's
predicting Michigan to win this one, or
I was. Well, I just feel like that's college basketball, where we can talk about the clash of styles, but when there is absolutely not a clash in styles and two teams play a very similar way, like, that's where you start to see blowouts in college basketball. I think in a lot of instances, it's not the only times you see blowouts even between good teams, but like, that is one recipe where it's like, okay, like, well, two teams that like to play fast. Well, who's better at playing fast? Michigan. Two teams that, really play on the interior. Well, who's tougher on the interior? Who's better on the Michigan. And then you can even look at like, okay, well, then you've got this thing called the 3-point line, and who has a advantage there? Okay, like ding, 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 massive advantage.
Advantage.
So just for me, it's like, I'm not trying to say that Arizona's bad or not good. Like, they're in a Final Four for a reason, but just one of those things that like, I just didn't particularly see an area in which I thought Arizona was better in any particular category than Michigan. And but yeah, I was ready to see what was going to happen, because I did think it was somewhat poetic that in this season where the roster build among the teams that had the money to do so was to get as big as possible while still playing fast. I thought it was somewhat poetic that one of these national semifinals was like the two champions of that style of play. I think that Michigan and Arizona proved themselves to be the best at that, more than Iowa State, more than Florida, more than Tennessee, Houston, whoever you want to throw into that mix. And then on the other side, you had, of course, Illinois, who's doing things the offensive way, and against the UConn team, which, of course, by the numbers was so much better defensively, yet in style of play, it's still hard not to look at them as an offensive team. And so I thought that was somewhat poetic, and that these were our two semifinals. And I thought it would have been, I'm not saying that Illinois would have won, but it would have probably been like most interesting if it was Illinois and their crazy offense and struggles on the defensive end versus a Michigan. I do think Michigan would have won that game more handily than they did against UConn. But yeah, that's just kind of the thing in this battle of two teams that are playing the same kind of, let's rebound the ball, let's get on the offensive glass, let's play really fast. I just, every single category, Arizona's really good, just like Michigan's a little bit better. And then you just go down the line in every one of those ways. And when there's no clash of style, I feel like those are the games that often just go in favor of the team that does it at a bit of higher level. And then we of course saw for Arizona fans, the worst case scenario of Michigan just like going crazy from three while Arizona, did their kind of regular thing of a respectable percentage, nothing wrong with it, but not a high level of attempts. And who knows too, I mean, even looking back, like I don't even remember which shots, I guess, on either of those sides, Michigan or Arizona, might have been in that lengthy period of garbage time. But yeah, that was the game. Like I know for a lot of people, that was the de facto championship, and like, hey, fair enough, that kind of maybe ended up being the case, but it might have been the de facto national championship, but it was definitely the national championship of teams that were playing bully ball. And so Michigan got that title as well, even before they got the natty.
Yeah, I think that's a fun way of putting it. And I think I had Michigan, as a little bit of a tier ahead of Arizona for most of the season, and a lot of Arizona fans were kind of upset at the way that I framed that, but I did think that Michigan had the edge. But that did not mean that I thought Arizona wasn't capable of A, winning this game, or B, winning a national title, and they would have been a very deserving champion if they had pulled that off. And I do think it is a little bit disappointing that their brilliant season ended in this way, in such a flat manner, because they're going to be remembered very differently than even if they had just lost by 5 in this game. So to me, that was a bit of a disappointing thing. I think when I was looking for the reasons why Arizona could win this game, it was their guards on paper coming into this game were arguably better than Michigan's. You would have taken Jaden Bradley, the Big 12 Player of the Year. Braden Burry is one of the most clutch, composed freshmen. Both of those guys really felt like a very stereotypical Final Four backcourt. And comparing that before these games started to, say, Elliot Cadeau and Namari Burnett, you would have thought Arizona had the edge there. Ultimately, Cadeau was just so vicious defensively, they weren't able to get into a rhythm, and then the rest of Michigan's length and athleticism just completely took away any sort of confidence and comfortability that the guards had. And then the other thing too, which was a surprise, was that Arizona has just been so consistent all season. They hadn't a single, in their 2 losses, they went right down to the wire in every other game in the clutch time, that they're winning games that are close. And so you just didn't really think that they would allow themselves to get completely blown out like that. I think Tommy Lloyd talked a little bit afterwards about how, he said ultimately they hadn't been in a situation like this before where they were down 15 in the first half, and it was a little bit of what do we do in this situation? We've never quite been there. So credit to Michigan for being able to punch them in the mouth early, because that really kind of threw them out of their rhythm. But I do think I just want to give Arizona credit for the great season that they had, even though it ended in this way. Let's go to the other semifinal game, and then we'll wrap up some potential roster build stuff here. So UConn, I just want to take big picture how I would say arguably that though UConn won titles in 2023 and 2024, and those back-to-back was as impressive a 2-year run as you're ever going to see, I would say arguably their run to the title game in this tournament, given their roster and given the teams that they had to play, the adversity injury-wise that they had to overcome, I would say it's more impressive that they got to a title game in this tournament than them winning their previous 2, based on how likely of a favorite they were in that second year, certainly. And in the first year, it was clear by the time we got to the tournament, even though they were a 4 seed, that they were a really strong team, and they had a relatively simple path once they got to the Final Four because of how weak the rest of that Final Four was. If you looked at the pre-tournament odds of them making the title game On my website, it was 6%. There was only a 6% chance that they would get here, and that's knowing that they were a very good team. And obviously the comeback against Duke was probably the moment of the tournament, big picture, in terms of what we're going to remember for years and years to come. The Braylon Mullins shot, obviously, but the, overcoming a 19-point deficit. So very impressive. And I think this win over Illinois was kind of an example and capped that off. Terrace Reed, my goodness, in this tournament. He was probably overall the most impressive player in this tournament. Even though they didn't win the title, he finishes this tournament with averaging 19.5 points and 13 rebounds per game in this tournament. He had 17 and 11 against Illinois. So I thought his run was incredibly impressive. And just the fact that they were able to play all the teams that they did, beating UCLA, Michigan State, Duke, Illinois, all who had a variety of bigs who were very challenging and tough to play against. And Terrace Reed, stood out amongst all of them and outshone them. Was super impressive. And then, on the Illinois side of things, I also thought this was another example of a game where, man, there were so many shots for Illinois that I felt like their energy level was below par for most of this game. They didn't look quite as up to the task as UConn did, but I will say that they had a lot of shots that didn't come close to the rim, but a lot of that went kind of in and out. There were a lot of buckets. I thought, this is dropping. There were probably 4 or 5 of them that didn't. So they had a lot of breaks not go their way as well. So I thought it was a well-fought game. UConn, the deserving winner. Anything else that stuck out to you from this one?
Yeah, well, I know there's been a couple of like, oh, I told you so from me on the podcast. I got to just point out that I definitely thought Illinois was going to win this one, and I thought Illinois was really going to control this one. So this is the one I was way wrong on, and just to see the way that particularly like Mirkovic, like some of the play they had from some of their like bigger wings and even like Jake Davis at times, like just whenever they caught the ball on the wing, trying to get into some of those like second side actions, just like the way that UConn was able to shift over and make things difficult and route those guys away from where they were trying to go. It just like felt like these possessions for Illinois that were turned into longer, more uncomfortable situations that ended in the hands of someone other than Keaton Wagler where they'd like to have it. I just, again, thought that was I mentioned how I thought that like as much as the numbers obviously show that UConn was a much better defensive team than an offensive team. It's still hard for me not to like watch them and talk to coaches that have to prepare for them and like still view them as an offensive team. But then you watch what they did against Illinois and you're like, yeah, like that is what they were this year. They were tremendous on the defensive end. I think that's also what goes back to what you were saying about just how impressive it was for them to get into the title game with this particular team. Is like you look at a lot of the prototypical things you would look for from a team that could be a top 10 defense or whatever you want to say UConn was by the end of the season, whether by the numbers or by the eye test or whatever combination of the two. Like it's not like they're loaded with a ton of athleticism and length on the wing. Like I'm not saying they don't have some of that, like they certainly do, but the way that they were so connected and the way that they were able to keep everything in front. And I think that you mentioned it, like there was some luck, I would say, involved with some of the shots that didn't fall for Illinois. But I also think like UConn did well to just take away the home runs, the layups, the real easy stuff, and just kind of like try their luck with some semi-contested catch and shoot attempts, and ultimately that worked. And that's kind of what you got to do when you don't have elite athleticism, elite defenders going against an Illinois team that was so dominant. So this game was incredible. And I know you mentioned Reed as well. I also thought just his ability to dominate one-on-one, even against like size and like physicality, like that had me thinking like, oh man, maybe this guy actually could like have do something against Michigan. You saw like a little bit of that where he had a couple of moments doing a great job taking it right into Mars' chest, but wasn't quite enough. So I think too, that was a guy that has kind of been seen as like, a serviceable, big-bodied player that like never quite kind of reached his ceiling until this tournament, where you were like, oh my goodness, this player is tremendous, and he is destined to have quite a pro career, I would think.
Yeah, and the development that he has had over his 2 years at UConn has been astounding, because like you said, I don't think people really expected him to be this level of player when he transferred from Michigan to UConn, and was really their only interior force that they had all season, and he more than handled that mantle against a lot of teams like Illinois who had multiple different bigs that he had to compete against. So that was amazing. Alex Karaban didn't have the best tournament. Safe to say, I think he was 5 for 23 from 3 going back to the Duke game in those final 3 games. So tough to see that one of their most reliable players, who, by the way, Alex Karaban has played in his college career in 20 NCAA tournament games. That is insane to have that many. That's like almost a whole season worth of basketball just in March Madness. So just a credit to him and what he was able to do. I know that he will, have some regrets about his performances, but you can't take away from, what he meant to this team. And again, just super impressed with UConn. Illinois came up short. Obviously, I think they ultimately had a first half slow start, which has been a theme of theirs in this tournament, where they had 24 first half points against Houston, 28 against Iowa in the Elite Eight. They had 29 in this game. Those were their 3 lowest first half point totals of the season. They were able to have great second halves. Those previous 2 games against UConn, that was not the case. So that came back to bite them. So tough to overcome that in one of those games finally. But, overall, Illinois was one of the most interesting, intriguing teams from a roster build perspective, certainly. And I know that even though they came up short and didn't make the title game or win a title, a lot of teams will be paying attention to what they did from a recruiting perspective. Let's go ahead and go kind of, end this conversation with talking about some of the things that other teams will try and copy. Let's be real. This is a copycat league, and when something is successful, other teams will try and emulate it. There were a lot of things that teams like Michigan did this year that they succeeded in that other teams tried to do and sort of failed. From the Michigan side of things, the 3 big experiments, if you will, of having a Daimara, Morez Johnson, Yaxel Lendeborg, all traditionally players who would play at the 4 or the 5, all being on the court together a lot. And that ended up working really well for them. I know is something other teams are going to copy. They're obviously not the only team this season that was successful doing that. You look at Arizona, you look at Florida, you look at several other teams like Duke, who were just had massive front courts and had some guys playing down at the 3. Florida being another example of that. That's certainly going to be a trend going forward. What are your thoughts overall on the things that you think are most likely to happen in terms of what coaching staffs are looking at and how they're trying to build title contending rosters based on sort of the trends this season, and what do you think will work?
Well, this is really interesting because so 2 years ago, UConn wins their second championship, and they're playing at one of the slowest paces in the country. They're calling a set on every play. And this was at a time where everyone is talking about, oh, we're going to get up and down. We're going to play fast. We don't, a lot of coaches really, loud about like, we don't run sets. We play conceptually. We play out of concepts. And then you've got like UConn, who's like, yeah, we're valuing every possession. Like it's the last possession of the game, and we're calling a set, and we're going to value the rock, and we're going to try to get the best shot in every possession. And I kind of thought to myself, now this is something that might change college basketball. People are going to see the success of this, and they are going to say, okay, instead of just preaching, hey, we need to play fast, we need to play out of concepts, we are actually going to just, get guys that are, we're going to really drill down that we're going to learn bigger playbooks, and we're going to run sets, and we're going to slow it down. Now that didn't happen at all. And I shouldn't say at all, but it certainly did not. It doesn't appear like that really changed the trajectory of the sport at all, in my opinion. And the reason why I also thought that was something that was going to be replicated was the fact that, like, I know this is a little bit different than the consulting you did, but like, it wouldn't matter if like Bethune-Cookman or Wake Forest or Youngstown State was going to look at that run. They could be like, okay, well, like UConn plays slow, they play really methodically, they run a ton of sets. Like we can do that at our level. Like no matter what, anyone could have watched that and said like, yeah, like we probably need some like smart players, but like if we really work on this, like we can probably play really slow, run a lot of sets, not push the ball as much. So then you look at this and you look at like Michigan and you look at Arizona, and earlier in the season you look at the other 1 seeds. You look at like a Florida. what is Wake Forest got, like, what can Wake Forest look at that and say, like, we can do that? What's like a Virginia Tech and like, so that's just why I'm like, I don't know if this is a trend necessarily. Now I know you also did say like teams that are trying to build national championship rosters, which is an elite few. And if this is the trend, like, it is only going to be an elite few, because this is a trend that, like, again, if you are a mid-major team watching this, like, there's nothing to learn from that, really, like, until you can get that kind of player. And I mean, unless you do just get whatever possible size and length you can and just put those guys out and have a little bit more of a leash of like, okay, we're going to be less concerned with ball handling and shooting because we think we can just put out as much size as we can at our level, whatever that may be. Maybe that's 6'8" at center and 6'7" at the 4 and 6'6" at the 3, but you're in the Ohio Valley, and that's just like, whatever you do, you get that side. Like, maybe that happens, but I just don't know if that's actually going to really change things. And when it comes to the teams that are looking to build national championship rosters and have the means to do that, like, yeah, I do think the teams that have the money are, just like they did last summer, they are going to pay up for multiple 7-footers, multiple true centers, and feel free to put them out there. And for me, it's what's going to be interesting is, what does everyone outside of those 10 to 15 programs do? Do they look at what UConn was able to accomplish this year? And I went back and like, well, they won 2 championships. I don't think anyone's going to look at what they did this year and now think, oh, we should play that way. But like, you also did see Iowa playing a similar style and beat Florida and go on a run themselves. Like, I do wonder if more coaches are going to look at that. But at the same time, if you didn't watch UConn win 2 national championships and say like, hey, I think this is something that could kind of work, I don't know if you're going to do it now. But for anyone outside of these national championship contenders, like, that's just the thing, is like, I just don't know what people in one bid leagues are thinking about watching Michigan, saying, okay, well, what can we do at our level based on what Michigan did? How can we win our league? Well, it's just like, at this point, it's different games. And then like, of course, it would have been interesting if Illinois went a little farther just to see the conversations about furthering the European guys as well. And, maybe that's a way that a year or two ago, you maybe could get some front court guys for a little bit cheaper, and guys that are ready to contribute right away. But like, man, now the pendulum might swing the other way, like seeing some of these guys. And for people listening that don't know, like, the European basketball world is one that I am very involved with. And I am seeing guys that I don't think are very good that are getting much more than I think they should. And like, hey, that's all credit to them. But it's just funny, for years, it was an untapped market, and there was guys that should have got opportunities and didn't, or guys that like did come to college basketball, went to lower levels than they should, and now I almost feel like the pendulum's going to swing the other way because of the success some guys have had. So I am actually like, while I for years have been someone that's like, I think these European players are amazing, I think that they're underrated. They're going to be like, I actually think that there's going to be a lot of European players that are letdowns this year, because I think the pendulum might have swung the other way. So those are some of my kind of roster builds that touches on really all 4 teams, I guess.
There's so much interesting stuff there. I did some research a little bit earlier this season, looking at just what was the impact the actual international recruits that came in as freshmen, quote unquote, actually had this season. And basically what you found was you had some teams like Illinois and Virginia who found really great international recruits that ended up being top 3 to 4 players in their team and were awesome. But I know a lot of other teams sort of just viewed it as a like kind of hoping it was just throwing a dart at a dartboard and seeing if it stuck, and they got names, and some of those players just didn't pan out. And so I do think you're right. It's not just that any international prospect will work. It's about finding the right ones and knowing how to actually be good at valuing that talent. So that'll be interesting to watch. I do think just a couple notes from me on the Michigan thing specifically, because they're the one who ended up being the most dominant team this season, and everyone's going to be thinking about this as the likely blueprint for winning in the future. For starters, it's obviously well cataloged that Michigan had, among the largest resources of any team that ended up being in the sport this year. But it's not like they were comfortably number one. I don't know the exact numbers, but I would say there were probably 10 to 15 other teams that you could say were kind of in that range of spending a lot of money. Some notable teams that's been publicly stated, teams like Kentucky, who had over $20 million for their roster, obviously fell well short of what Michigan did this season. So it wasn't just throwing a lot of money at it, because a lot of other teams did that too. It was about doing it in a way that was smart, that fit their scheme, that found underrated talent at that price point. Players like Elliot Cadeau, who, I had rated a lot higher than he was viewed as a consensus player. He ends up being a really great fit for them. Obviously, they had to pay up for guys like Adai and Morez Johnson, but the way that they have turned out to be as players this year was even better than a lot of other people expected. I will mention a little bit more detail on this later in the show. I know that Michigan used a lot of analytically driven tools like the front office suite, which is a tool that I have at evanmiya.com. They use that, among other things, to help shape their roster. And so it is not just about chasing the players with the biggest cachet who might cost the most money. It's about being really smart and efficient with the way that you're using your money. So obviously that's going to be something that I know every team is paying more attention to this offseason. The other couple trends I found are interesting is if you look at before this tournament, most teams who won a national title, if not all teams, had a strong reliance on returning players as a part of their roster build. I think every champion in the modern portal era until this year had over 50% of their minutes played by guys who were on the team the previous season. And then they brought in fresh talent through the portal or through the high school ranks or international ranks to sort of supplement that. But there was the bulk of their production still came from returning players. This season, the average percentage of roster continuity has dropped every single year over the last several years because of how much more fluid these roster situations are. So every single Final Four team this year still was above average in that department. I think the average percentage of minutes played amongst high majors by returning players was 30%. Every Final Four team was above that. So it still is important to be on that side of things. But Michigan was at 34%. In other words, 34% of their minutes were played by returning players. Everything else came from their freshmen or their transfers. So they had a challenge ahead of them of saying, how can we get all of these new pieces to be, you look at their starting lineup. Outside of Namuri Burnett, it was Yaxel Lendeborg, Adai Mara, Elliot Cadeau, Morez Johnson. They were the most important players on the team. They were able to pull something off that I don't think is a given for every team. So I really give them a lot of credit for that. And the last thing that I will mention is I think there is even though a mid-major team can't try and copy what Michigan did because they're just not going to be able to have the ability to get those same types of players, there is going to be and already has been a trickle-down effect from, okay, well, if the best teams at the very top are going to try and build this monster front court type of identity, what that means is the market for all bigs is just going to get astronomically big. Because if those players are getting taken off the board for high amounts of money, well, then the next guys who maybe wouldn't be good enough to play and start for a Michigan, but maybe they would be good enough to start for a Cincinnati or a Georgia or a St. Mary's or something, they're also going to want more money because they're the next ones in line. And so I still do think we're going to have a trickle down of the emphasis on bigs or the amount of money it's going to take to get a quality big will be higher than ever before. What that makes me wonder is, will we see other types of roster builds that de-emphasize that for the sake of getting a better allocation of their money on talent at the other positions? Will we actually see those teams succeed more this year? I look at a team this year like Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was not a team that had a classic big. Jalen Washington, I guess, was the big that qualified, but they were a more sort of guard and wing dependent team, and they found a lot of really good roster pieces both through their returners and through the portal of guys who were underrated but really fit and were very talented at their level. I wonder if we're going to see more teams like that be successful. Those are just kind of a few of the thoughts that come off my head as we discuss that. I will be doing a lot more research on the whole economics of the portal and things like that in the coming weeks, so listeners can stay tuned for that. But any final thoughts on any of that stuff that I mentioned there?
Yeah, I think that when you looked at the portal even 3 years ago, which is funny because it feels like an eternity ago, I felt like the most overvalued player was like the undersized combo guard gunner. And a lot of those guys that had really good production, raw production, I will say, a lot of those guys did really well in terms of getting to much bigger schools. And looking at the portal right now, there is just an absolute glut of guys that are 6'3" and under, not really point guards. And many of them have averaged in multiple leagues from low major to high major are averaging 15 to 23 points a game. Most shoot the ball pretty well. Most defensively are not great, and there's just so many players that are on good teams from good leagues averaging 17 points per game and 2.3 assists. And there's so many guys out there that a lot of teams could get excited, the fans could get excited about. And the story of this year's portal, as so much of that money has gone away from these guards and going to the front court, the story of this year's portal evaluations to me are going to be which teams can get the actual good players from that batch. I just think that's kind of my last portal kind of roster build type thing. But like, could you see someone end up with two absolute studs in the Vanderbilt type? Not that those guys were like, mid-major type, but like that style of like two really, really good smaller guards in the backcourt that can be awesome and lead an elite offense. Like, I wonder if that's out there somewhere for a whole lot less than building a roster the other way. And but yeah, just kind of generally speaking, like one look through the portal, and that's what you see a whole bunch of, and you do not see a lot of impactful centers, and the ones that are there, man, are they going to get paid? So that'll be interesting. But yeah, those would be my final thoughts.
And if you're listening to this show and you want to track the portal closer, I have multiple times daily updated portal ratings for every single player who has announced that they're going to the portal or who has signed with teams. You can see my analytical evaluation of them and a lot more. So you can find that stuff at evanmiya.com. Eric, this has been awesome. Both your insight on the games and talking about the roster construction stuff, I think the listeners will find very interesting. So thank you so much for joining me on the show today. And I hope you enjoy the off season, and maybe that it's a little bit slower for you, though. Realistically speaking, for anyone involved either in the content business or on the sort of coaching side, which you are both, things don't necessarily slow down right now. So either way, I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for joining me today. Thank you to Eric Fawcett for joining me today. You can find all of Eric's work on Twitter at @EricFawcett_. Eric does a lot of different stuff. He does some stuff for Basket Under Review. He does stuff for a couple other publications. He does a lot of stuff on Twitter, breaking down X's and O's. He is a great follow for all that sort of stuff. He also is involved and with a lot of different teams in what they're doing as well. So be sure to go follow all of Eric's stuff on Twitter at @EricFawcett_. All right, for this week's Analytics Corner, this is the portion of the show where I will talk a little bit more about analytically driven stuff, often from my website. And I will have more really dedicated analytics driven stuff for the transfer portal coming soon, which I will mention at the end of the show. So this will be pretty quick, but I will mention a couple different things to kind of to sort of set the stage for what we have coming ahead, as well as draw a bow on this tournament. First, on the tournament side of things, I know a lot of you guys really were dialed in for a lot of the bracket advice, insights, data that I shared during the week prior to the tournament starting. And I heard a lot of people who listen to this show tell me that the bracket stuff that I talked about really helped them win their bracket pool. If you've been following my bracket progress online, I ended up picking the correct winner in Michigan. I had 2 of the final 4 teams correct in Michigan and Illinois. My bracket finished in the 99.1 percentile. In other words, it was in the top 1% of brackets nationally. I was in a bracket pool with a bunch of other people who are in college basketball media, just as smart and as dialed in as I am. And I ended up winning that group as well as every other group that I was in this season with that bracket. So it was really awesome to see it pan out so well. It does take some luck breaking in your way to win a bracket pool, but if you make the right decisions and view it in a sort of bracket value lens of how can you sort of be contrary to what everyone else in your group is likely to be doing, if things do break right, it really does make your odds of winning your bracket pool higher. That's certainly what happened with my bracket this year. So it was very cool to see it do so well, as well as so many people who followed the advice and took similar principles and it working for their brackets too. So I look forward to doing that again next year. That does make it 2 out of the last 3 years where my bracket has finished in the 99th percentile. Last year, I think, was pretty poor. I had Florida losing early. They ended up winning the whole thing. So obviously that wrecked a lot of my bracket, but 2 out of 3 years, the process led to really good results. So that was really fun to see. The other thing that I will mention, and this is again a little bit of a teaser that we'll talk about more in the coming weeks, there has been some noise. I'm recording this on Tuesday. There has been some noise online about the front office suite tool, which is a tool that I have on my website that is specifically designed for teams and general managers to help with roster building and NIL evaluations. It is not a product that I make available like a lot of my other public subscriptions. It is something more specific for a certain clientele. And last November, I launched this product a year ago, right around the Final Four last year. And last November, I tweeted about it because I was given permission to, that Michigan was the first team who signed up for and started using the front office suite when I launched this back in April. So what that allowed them to do, as well as many of the other teams who used it, but they were kind of the first on board, is using my analytical projections for players to translate to estimated dollar amounts in terms of how much they're worth. This tool responds to the current market, allows for each user or team to put in intel that represents where the current market is at, and it helps my tool kind of fill in how much everyone roughly should be worth based on their projected impact and where the market is currently at. And so obviously, I cannot attribute a much of Michigan's success to my tool, because Michigan had so many other sources I know for ways that they went about recruiting players, as well as all of the great coaching and development that took them to a national title. So I do not want to claim any large portion of their success, but it was very cool to see that the very first team that did sign up for this, obviously the way that they built their roster really turned out to be quite incredible. A lot of other teams are trying to replicate similar things who had similar budgets, but really failed to execute on putting a roster together that, number one, worked, and number two, had as much chemistry and ultimately as much power as what Michigan was able to pull off. So it was very cool to see that. I was a little bit reticent to kind of toot my own horn, if you will, with that last night coming into today, just because, again, I don't want to take more credit than I deserve for that, because it's a very, very small slice of the pie. And I do know that I'm sure I was not the only analytical tool that they were using to do that. But nonetheless, very cool to see how that kind of played out. And with that being said, there are other programs who, like Kentucky, who have announced recently that they're also using the front office suite, as well as other things to help assemble their rosters. At this point, I have around 30 teams who are using the front office suite for this offseason, and would continue to expect that to grow, just as more teams are seeing the value of using analytically driven tools like mine to not only help identify which players are the best players to recruit, but also how does that translate to using your money wisely? Because there is a big difference now between just like ranking transfer portal players to actually saying, okay, well, if these two players are similar, but one player is going to cost twice as much, it's a much better use of our money to spend that money elsewhere and maybe get two players for the price of one. And that allows for your budget to go further. So really cool to see some of the reception and conversation around that tool, and looking forward to seeing that more going forward. We will touch on a lot more transfer portal stuff in the coming weeks, so please stay tuned for that. I do want to spend just a little bit of time talking about reflections from the Final Four this weekend. Outside of the games, which we've already discussed, Indianapolis is my home city. It's where I grew up, and my wife and I recently moved back to Indianapolis. This was my first time experiencing Indianapolis as a Final Four city as an adult. So very cool to kind of see how well Indianapolis does it. A lot of people who go to Final Fours regularly will talk about how the big three are Indianapolis, New Orleans, and San Antonio as being the sort of like most desirable, most logistically friendly Final Four sites. Obviously, Indianapolis typically does not have the same weather to compete with some of those other cities, but logistically, I mean, Indianapolis does such an incredible job. Everything is so close between Lucas Oil Stadium, downtown Indianapolis, where, a lot of the restaurants and bars are, the convention center where the NABC does their convention, as well as a lot of the fan stuff. It is literally all within walking distance. It was very, very easy to get around. Indianapolis had a tough challenge because not only did they have the Final Four, they also had several other championships going on all in the same weekend, but they pulled it off great. So that was really cool to see how well they did that. For me personally, outside of the games, which, were in and of themselves not that entertaining compared to, say, what we had in last year's Final Four, but there were so many other great things that happened, for me personally, the Final Four is the best opportunity I have every single year to network with a lot of people in media, as well as meet up with a lot of coaches, because everyone is in town for the length of several days. Several cool things for me personally that occurred in chronological order here. I had the opportunity, second year in a row, to be a featured speaker, if you will, at the NABC. This is the National Association of Basketball Coaches, I think is what it stands for. The NABC conference, coaches conference, is a thing that happens every Thursday, Friday at the Final Four. A lot of coaches come in for this. It's a networking event, but it's also an event for education on a lot of different things. There was a general manager session for the first time this year, and I was invited to speak in that with a bunch of other really brilliant folk, both coaches and other kind of people adjacent to the college basketball space. That was a really cool experience to get to do that and talk about some of the roster building tools that I do and use, and just kind of talking about general strategies for general managers in this modern portal climate. So that was a really cool experience getting to do that, and I met a lot of great people afterwards. Saturday morning, there is a tradition that happens every Final Four for people who are kind of national media members. An email chain gets sent around, and there is often a group of anywhere between 10 and 20 people in the media who will show up for a basketball pickup game. This year it happened at Hinkle Fieldhouse, which was an especially cool venue for that. So it was really fun to play in that game. I did not technically play in the game this year, though I did show up. I am still recovering from an ACL surgery back last summer, so I was probably close to being ready to play, but couldn't play this year. But I brought a clipboard and did some analytics and plus minus for everyone else who was playing. So that was super fun. And if you were one of those who was there, thank you for making that experience enjoyable. And then last thing I will say too is I love getting to meet fans at the Final Four. I never, I haven't like hosted an event per se, but there were a lot of fans. I know some of you listening to this show came up and introduced yourself to me over the Final Four weekend. That was really cool just to get to meet listeners of the show who, I've only been doing this since January, and I got a lot of really positive feedback from people saying that they love the show and that it's been a regular part of their sort of college basketball content intake. So that was just really, really encouraging to meet people in person who are listeners of the show. So anyone who said something to me over the weekend, I really appreciate that. That meant a lot to me. Before we get out of here, I do want to announce the winner of our listener contest. The contest that I announced last week was to pick the player whose BPR improved the most over the Final Four between then and this week's show. Any of the players from the Final Four teams were eligible, and the winner went to Reese Van Haften at Reese_VH on Twitter, who picked Trey McKinney. And Trey McKinney was the most improved player from last weekend to now in terms of how he performed, and his overall stock improved in his player rating at evanmiya.com. So congrats to Reese. I will be sending you your free merch item of choosing in the mail. And for anyone else who wants to get merch stuff, you can find the link to the merch store at evanmiya.com. Before we get out of here as well, I will note that the cadence of the show will change going forward. I was doing a once-a-week show during the season. I will not be doing that during the offseason, partly just because there's way less to cover. So what I'm planning on doing is sometime over the next couple weeks, having an episode or two that is dedicated to off-season transfer portal related stuff. Doing a lot of really interesting research now about the way that teams are approaching the portal, evaluating players, tracking transfer classes, how budgets and NIL are interacting with all this. And so I'm going to have some really good content related to that, both on the podcast and on my blog at blog.evanmiya.com. So I don't know exactly when those episodes will drop on the podcast feed, but they will be up, and there will be some stuff over the next month or two related to that. So please be tuned for that, but I do not know exactly the cadence of that. Once we get to the heart of the off season, probably June, July, August, September, there will probably be a bit of a hiatus over the summer as I'm just working on a bunch of other stuff. But I am planning on revealing the preseason team and player ratings on this show sometime around August is when I will do that, and subscribers to the show will get that information first before it actually gets put up on evanmiya.com. So I'm already looking forward to that. It's just a couple months away from having an idea of what the 2026-27 season will pan out. So looking forward to that. Thank you all for being here. It has been, finishing up the season here. It's been such a wonderful experience starting this show back in January, and all of the positive reception and dedicated listenership that I've gotten over the last couple months. So I really appreciate everyone who's here. We'll be back sometime soon. As always, this is an ad-free show. So if you listen on the podcast platforms on Apple or Spotify, please give us a 5-star review. It really helps grow the podcast and helps more people find it. Leave a review as well. I love to read reviews on the show. So if you leave a review, I will likely get to it. If you watch on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. Like the video, leave comments. Again, a lot of that stuff is helpful, and I love to read those comments as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. It truly means a lot to me. I will see all of you guys next time.